The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn silence of Nellis Air Force Base like a blade through silk. Captain Sarah Mitchell jolted awake in her cramped quarters, her heart already racing before her feet hit the cold concrete floor. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that would soon give way to another scorching day. But Sarah wouldn't be watching the sunrise from the ground, not today, not ever. She was a pilot, even if the brass seemed to forget that detail more often than she cared to count dot as she pulled on her flight suit. The familiar weight of disappointment settled on her shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. For 3 years, she'd been flying support missions, cargo runs, personnel transport, routine patrols that any fresh-faced lieutenant could handle blindfolded. Meanwhile, her male counterparts soared off on combat missions, their call signs becoming legend while hers collected dust in forgotten briefing rooms. "Mitchell, you're on supply run to Forward Operating Base Delta," her commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, had announced just yesterday, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Equipment drop, nothing fancy. Think you can handle that?" The condescension in his voice was as thick as the desert heat, and Sarah had swallowed her response along with her pride, offering only a crisp, "Yes, sir," in return. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The thing about being dismissed as just support is that people stop seeing you as a threat, stop watching your every move, stop caring about what you're capable of. They see the cargo plane and assume limitation. They see the routine missions and assume mediocrity. What they don't see is the countless hours Sarah spent in simulators, pushing herself beyond the standard requirements. What they don't see is her studying combat maneuvers during her off time, memorizing terrain maps of hostile territories, preparing for opportunities that never seemed to come. Sarah's story began long before that fateful morning at Nellis. Growing up in rural Montana, she'd spent her childhood gazing at contrails scratched across the endless sky, dreaming of the day she'd be the one painting those white lines against the blue. Her father, a mechanic who'd served briefly in the Army, had encouraged her dreams with the kind of quiet support that builds unshakable foundations. "Flying's not about the machine, Sarah," he'd tell her while they worked together in his garage, grease-stained hands pointing toward the heavens. "It's about the heart of the person holding the stick." The path to her wings hadn't been easy. The Air Force Academy had tested every ounce of her determination, pushing her physically, mentally, and emotionally in ways she'd never imagined. She'd graduated in the top 10% of her class, her test scores in flight mechanics and aerial navigation consistently outperforming her peers. But somehow, those achievements seemed to evaporate the moment she received her first assignment. "You've got steady hands and good judgment," her first commander had told her. Words that should have been a compliment, but felt more like a gentle shove toward the margins. Perfect for support operations. And so began her career of being perfectly qualified for missions that others considered beneath them, watching from the sidelines as less experienced pilots earned their combat ribbons and advancement opportunities. Morning of what would become the most important day of her career started like any other. Sarah performed her pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had become her signature. Her aircraft, a C-130 Hercules transport plane, wasn't the sleekest bird in the sky, but it was reliable, sturdy, and capable of feats that would surprise anyone who underestimated it, much like Sarah herself. As she ran through her systems checklist, her radio crackled to life with routine chatter from the control tower. Weather conditions were optimal, visibility unlimited, and the flight path to Phobe Delta was well established and secure. It should have been another milk run, another box checked on another ordinary day in her extraordinary ordinary career. But fate, as Sarah would soon discover, has a way of turning ordinary moments into defining ones. Sometimes the universe waits For just the right person to be in just the right place at just the right time, armed with just the right combination of skill, determination, and stubborn refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. As Sarah taxied toward the runway, her cargo bay loaded with supplies and her passenger manifest showing a routine rotation of personnel, she had no idea that within hours, she'd be facing a crisis that would test every skill she'd ever learned and every boundary she'd ever been told not to cross. The radio chatter was routine, the weather perfect, and the mission parameters exactly what everyone expected from the pilot they'd labeled as just support. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments, and as Sarah's engines roared to life and her wheels left the tarmac, she was about to prove that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. The flight to Forward Operating Base Delta unfolded exactly as Sarah had expected, smooth, routine, and utterly predictable. Her C-130 cut through the morning air like a reliable workhorse, steady and sure. Below, the landscape shifted from Nevada's burnt orange desert to the more varied terrain of the operational theater, a patchwork of browns and greens that had become as familiar to her as her own backyard after dozens of similar runs. In the cargo bay behind her, 23 soldiers settled in for what they assumed would be a standard transport flight. Most were returning from leave, their faces carrying that particular mixture of resignation and determination that came with heading back to active deployment. A few were replacements, fresh-faced, and trying not to look nervous about their first taste of life in a forward operating base. None of them paid much attention to the pilot's voice over the intercom. After all, transport flights were routine, and transport pilots were just the bus drivers of the military aviation world. Staff: Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a combat medic with 2 deployments under her belt, had claimed a seat near the front of the cargo area. She'd flown with Sarah twice before, and had always been impressed by the smoothness of her landings, even in challenging conditions. While her fellow passengers dozed or lost themselves in books and music, Maria found herself studying the pilot. Through the open cockpit door, noting the confident way Sarah's hands moved across the controls, the alertness in her posture despite the routine nature of the flight. "You know," Maria had mentioned to her friend during their last rotation, "Mitchell flies like she's expecting trouble, even on milk runs. Always ready, always thinking 3 steps ahead." It was a trait that most people interpreted as excessive caution or anxiety, but Maria recognized it for what it truly was: exceptional situational awareness and the kind of preparation that separated good pilots from great ones. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Sarah's radio crackled with routine position reports from other aircraft in the area. The airspace was busy but organized, a carefully choreographed dance of military and civilian traffic that spoke to the precision of modern air traffic control. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which, in Sarah's experience, was usually when plans started to fall apart. She'd learned long ago to trust her instincts, even when everything appeared normal on the surface. Today, something felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The radio chatter seemed slightly more tense than usual, with longer pauses between transmissions and a subtle urgency in the controllers' voices that suggested they were dealing with something beyond routine traffic management. "Cargo 77, this is Desert Control," came the voice through her headset, using her aircraft's call sign. "Be advised, we're tracking some unusual weather patterns in your destination area. Nothing serious at this time, but keep us posted on your observations as you get closer." Weather patterns. Sarah had been flying long enough to know that unusual weather patterns could mean anything from unexpected wind shear to full-blown sandstorms that could ground entire squadrons. But her instruments showed clear skies ahead, and the meteorological briefing she'd received before takeoff had indicated optimal conditions throughout her flight path. As they continued eastward, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to her radio, listening not just to the transmissions directed at her aircraft, but to the broader pattern of communications filling the airwaves. There was something happening, something that the controllers weren't discussing openly, but that was clearly consuming their attention. She caught fragments of conversations, references to search patterns, discussions of fuel states, and most telling of all, repeated attempts to contact an aircraft that wasn't responding. "Desert Control, Cargo 77, Sarah called, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Request clarification on traffic in my area. I'm picking up some chatter. That suggests possible complications." The pause before the response lasted just a beat too long. "Cargo 77, continue current heading. Will advise if any course changes are necessary." In the military, what people don't tell you is often more important than what they do. Sarah had learned to read between the lines of official communications, to hear the stress in controllers' voices and the significance of extended radio silences. Something was definitely wrong, and the fact that they weren't sharing details with a routine support flight told her everything she needed to know about how the command structure viewed her role in whatever was developing. But Sarah had spent 3 years being overlooked and underestimated, 3 years of having her capabilities dismissed and her potential ignored. She'd also spent those 3 years preparing for moments exactly like this one, studying scenarios and practicing maneuvers that went far beyond the requirements of her assigned missions. While others saw limitations in her role, she'd seen opportunities to develop skills that nobody expected her to possess. As FOB Delta appeared on the horizon, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be the first of many that day. Instead of simply following her flight plan and hoping someone would eventually fill her in on whatever crisis was developing, she began actively monitoring all radio frequencies available to her aircraft. If something was happening that might affect her mission or her passengers, she was going to know about it, regardless of whether anyone thought she needed to know. The first piece of the puzzle came through a transmission on a frequency typically reserved for combat operations. A pilot's voice, tight with stress and fighting to remain professional. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper 2-1. We are down, repeat, we are down. 2 souls on board, critically injured. Request immediate medical evacuation." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Somewhere out there, fellow aviators were in trouble, and from the sound of the transmission, they were in serious trouble. The Mayday call cut through the routine radio chatter like a lightning bolt, transforming Sarah's ordinary transport mission into something far more complex and urgent. She adjusted her radio to better monitor the emergency frequency while maintaining her course toward FOB Delta, her mind already racing through possibilities and contingencies that her training had drilled into her, but that she'd never had occasion to use in real-world situations. "Viper 2-1, this is Desert Control," came the response. The air traffic controller's voice now carrying the sharp edge of crisis management. "We copy your Mayday. State your position and nature of injuries." The Jumban pilot's response was fragmented, broken by static and what sounded like labored breathing. "Desert Control, took fire over. Grid 7-7 ... Alpha. Aircraft is ... is down hard. Pilot unconscious. Possible spinal injury. I've got multiple fractures ... losing blood. Need immediate ... need immediate medevac." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she processed the information. Grid 77 Alpha was approximately 40 miles northeast of her current position, in a region of rough terrain that she knew well from studying topographical maps during her endless hours of mission preparation. More importantly, it was in an area that had seen increased hostile activity in recent weeks, making any rescue operation inherently dangerous. The radio erupted with coordinated activity as Desert Control began organizing the search and rescue operation. Sarah listened as they contacted various units, attempting to assemble the resources necessary for a complex extraction mission in potentially hostile territory. The problem became clear within minutes. The dedicated search and rescue helicopters were either out of range, already committed to other missions, or grounded for maintenance. The combat units with appropriate capabilities were engaged in operations that couldn't be interrupted without risking even more lives. "We've got a window." "Problem," she heard one controller say to another, not realizing their communication was being transmitted. "Starbirds are minimum 4 hours out, and these injuries won't wait that long. We need something now, or we're going to lose them." Sarah's hands tightened on her controls as the reality of the situation crystallized. 2 fellow aviators were bleeding out in hostile territory while the military bureaucracy struggled to organize a response that might arrive too late to matter. She thought about the medical supplies in her cargo bay, loaded as routine inventory for FOB Delta. She thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose medical training could mean the difference between life and death for the downed crew. Most of all, she thought about her aircraft's capabilities that everyone seemed to have forgotten in their focus on her support role. The C-130 Hercules wasn't just a cargo hauler. It was designed for versatility, capable of operating from rough airstrips and improvised landing zones. More importantly, it was equipped with defensive systems that, while not as sophisticated as those on dedicated combat aircraft, were sufficient for operations in moderately contested airspace. Sarah had trained extensively on all of these systems, despite the fact that her routine missions never required their use. "Desert Control, this is Cargo 77, Sarah called, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Request permission to divert to assist in search and rescue operations." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if her transmission had been received. When the response finally came, it carried a tone of polite dismissal that she'd heard countless times before. "Cargo 77, negative on the divert. Continue to FOB Delta as planned. SAR operations will be handled by appropriate assets." Appropriate assets. Sarah felt a familiar flash of frustration at the phrase, but this time it was tempered by something stronger, a determination that had been building for 3 years, and was now crystallizing into action. She looked back at her passengers, noting that several of them had heard the emergency transmissions and were looking toward the cockpit with expressions of concern and anticipation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had moved closer to the front of the cargo bay and was making eye contact with Sarah through the open cockpit door. The medic's expression was clear. She'd heard everything and was ready to help. Behind her, other soldiers were checking their equipment and preparing for whatever might come next, their training overriding any concerns about deviating from routine. Sarah made a decision that would either define her career or end it. She began a gradual course change toward Grid 77 Alpha, her movements subtle enough that ground controllers might not immediately notice the deviation. At the same time, she opened an internal communication channel to address her passengers. "Listen up," she announced, her voice carrying new authority that none of them had heard before. "We've got fellow service members in trouble about 30 minutes from our current position. I'm going to attempt a rescue operation, which means this transport just became a combat mission. Anyone who wants to opt out can say so now, and I'll drop you at the nearest friendly base." The response from the cargo bay was immediate and unanimous. 23 heads shaking no and voices calling out their readiness to help. These were professional soldiers who understood that the mission came first, regardless of what their transport orders said. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez moved to the front of the cargo bay, her medical kit already in her hands. "What do you need from us, Captain?" she asked. Sarah looked at the medic, then at the faces of the soldiers behind her, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in her military career, she wasn't just support. She was exactly where she needed to be, with exactly the right people, at exactly the right moment. The rescue that would change everything was about to begin. "Captain Mitchell, you're deviating from your assigned flight path." The voice of Desert Control crackled through Sarah's headset with unmistakable authority. They'd noticed her course change faster than she'd hoped, but not fast enough to stop what was already in motion. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either open doors or close them forever. "Desert Control, Cargo 77 requesting emergency authority to conduct search and rescue operations. I have medical personnel on board and aircraft capabilities suitable for extraction mission." The silence that followed was deafening. In that pause, Sarah could practically hear the wheels turning in the control room, supervisors being consulted, protocols being reviewed, and career implications being weighed. She used the time to continue her approach toward the last known position of Viper 2-1, her instruments painting a picture of increasingly challenging terrain ahead. "Cargo 77, you are not authorized for SAR operations," came the eventual response, the controller's voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Return to assigned flight path immediately." But Sarah had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Behind her, 23 soldiers were preparing for a mission that none of them had signed up for, but all of them believed in. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was organizing medical supplies, while other soldiers checked their weapons and prepared for the possibility of landing in contested territory. The energy in the cargo bay had transformed from routine transport tedium to focused military purpose. "Desert Control," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "I have 2 dying aviators 30 minutes from my current position and the capability to reach them before any other assets. I'm invoking emergency authority under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to preserve life and prevent the loss of military personnel." It was a calculated risk that drew on regulations most pilots knew existed, but few had ever invoked. Article 92 provided for deviation from orders when human life was at immediate risk and no superior authority was available to grant permission. Sarah was betting her career on a legal technicality and the hope that saving lives would ultimately outweigh insubordination charges. The radio erupted with cross-chatter as controllers tried to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their standard procedures. Sarah caught fragments of heated discussions about authorization levels, risk assessments, and the potential diplomatic implications of an unauthorized mission in contested airspace. But underneath all the bureaucratic concern, she also heard something else: grudging respect from the controllers who understood that she was doing what needed to be done, regardless of personal consequences. "Viper 2-1, this is Cargo 77, Sarah called on the emergency frequency, hoping the downed pilot was still conscious and able to respond. "We are en route to your position. Estimate 25 minutes to your location. Can you provide visual reference points or signal for identification?" The response was weak but immediate, the pilot's voice noticeably more labored than during his initial Mayday call. "Cargo 77, thank God, we're in a ravine. Approximately 2 clicks north of the main road, aircraft is ... is visible from the air, but landing zone is ... challenging, heavy vegetation, rocky terrain." Sarah's heart sank as she processed the description. A ravine with heavy vegetation and rocky terrain was exactly the kind of landing zone that C-130s were designed to avoid. Her aircraft needed relatively flat, clear areas to operate safely, and what the pilot was describing sounded like a helicopter extraction site at best. But as she crested a ridge and caught her first visual of the crash site, Sarah's extensive study of her aircraft's capabilities began to pay dividends. The C-130 might not be able to land in the ravine, but it had other options that most people never considered. The aircraft was equipped with cargo drop capabilities, designed for resupplying troops in areas where landing wasn't possible. More importantly, It had winch systems that could be adapted for personnel extraction in emergency situations. "Rodriguez," Sarah called back to the medic, "how comfortable are you with rappelling operations?" The staff sergeant's response was immediate and confident. "Airborne qualified, Captain. Done it dozens of times, though never from a C-130 in flight." Sarah smiled grimly. Neither had she, but her countless hours studying emergency procedures and unconventional applications of standard equipment were about to be put to the ultimate test. She began descending toward the crash site, her mind racing through calculations of altitude, airspeed, and the complex choreography required to execute a rescue that existed nowhere in official manuals. Below them, the terrain revealed itself in harsh detail. The crashed aircraft, a sleek fighter jet, lay crumpled in a narrow ravine, its wings sheared off by impact with rocky outcroppings. Smoke still rose from the wreckage, though whether from engine damage or electrical fires wasn't immediately clear. Most concerning was the complete absence of movement around the crash site. "Viper 2-1, we have visual on your aircraft," Sarah transmitted. "Do you copy?" The response was barely audible. "Copy. Pilot still unconscious. I single quotes getting weaker. Can't move from cockpit area." Sarah's jaw tightened with determination. The injured pilot was trapped near wreckage that could explode or catch fire at any moment, in terrain that no standard rescue procedure was designed to handle. But sometimes standard procedures weren't enough. Sometimes you had to write new ones on the fly. Literally, she began configuring her aircraft for the most unconventional rescue mission of her career, knowing that success would require perfect execution of maneuvers she'd only practiced in simulators and studied in theoretical scenarios. There would be no second chances, no backup plans, and no forgiveness for mistakes. The approach to the crash site required every ounce of Sarah's skill and training. The ravine was narrower than it had appeared from altitude, with rocky walls rising on both sides and barely enough clearance for her C-130's wingspan. She had to descend at a steep angle, while maintaining precise control over her airspeed and altitude, threading the needle between catastrophic impact and successful positioning for the rescue attempt. "All personnel, prepare for low altitude." "Maneuvering," Sarah announced over the internal communication system. "This is going to get rough." In the cargo bay, the soldiers braced themselves as the aircraft banked sharply and began what felt more like a controlled dive than a standard descent. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had secured herself near the rear cargo door, her medical kit strapped to her body and additional trauma supplies organized within easy reach. Two other soldiers, Corporals Jenkins and Martinez, had volunteered to assist with the rappelling operation despite having no formal training in aerial extraction procedures. The physics of what Sarah was attempting bordered on the impossible. C-130s weren't designed for precision hovering or the kind of low-speed maneuvering required for personnel extraction in confined spaces. But Sarah had spent countless hours studying the aircraft's performance envelope, learning capabilities that extended far beyond standard operating procedures. She knew that for brief periods, under ideal conditions, the C-130 could maintain flight at speeds slow enough to allow rappelling operations. "Desert Control, be advised we are beginning rescue operations," Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the complexity of what she was attempting. "Request immediate medical support standing by at FOB Delta for trauma casualties." The response crackled with tension. "Cargo 77, you are not authorized for this operation. Abort immediately and return to base." But Sarah was already committed, her aircraft now positioned directly over the crash site at an altitude of barely 200 feet. Through her windscreen, she could see the downed pilot moving weakly near the wreckage, while his unconscious companion remained motionless in what was left of the cockpit area. "Rodriguez, you're green for deployment," Sarah called, beginning the delicate process of maintaining stable flight at minimum airspeed while the cargo door opened behind her. The staff sergeant didn't hesitate. Within seconds, she was rappelling down a rope that had been hastily rigged from the aircraft's cargo handling system, her descent controlled but rapid as she aimed for a small clearing near the wreckage. Sarah held the aircraft steady, fighting wind currents that threatened to push her into the ravine walls while maintaining the precise positioning required to keep her medic's rope clear of obstacles. Rodriguez touched down with textbook precision, immediately disconnecting from her rappelling gear and rushing toward the injured pilots. Her voice came through on the emergency radio frequency. 2 casualties confirmed. 1 unconscious with visible head trauma and possible spinal injuries. 2nd pilot conscious, but showing signs of severe blood loss and what appears to be multiple fractures. Both require immediate medical evacuation. Sarah's mind raced through extraction options. Getting Rodriguez down had been challenging but manageable. Getting 2 critically injured patients back up to the aircraft would require a level of precision and coordination that pushed every system to its limits. Rodriguez, can the conscious pilot assist with securing the unconscious one for lift? Negative. Captain, he's too weak to be effective, and I don't want to risk further injury to either patient by rushing the stabilization process. This was the moment that would define everything. Sarah could attempt to maintain her hovering position while Rodriguez worked to stabilize the patients and prepare them for extraction. But her fuel consumption at low altitude was enormous, and the physical strain on her aircraft was pushing multiple systems toward their operational limits. Alternatively, she could land in a nearby area and approach the crash site on foot, but that would mean leaving her aircraft undefended in potentially hostile territory. The decision was made for her when her fuel gauge showed consumption rates that would leave her dangerously low for the return flight to Phobe Delta. She would have to land, regardless of the tactical implications. All personnel, prepare for emergency. Landing, Sarah announced, already scanning the terrain for the least impossible option. About half a mile from the crash site, she identified a stretch of relatively flat ground that might be suitable for a C-130 landing. It was shorter than ideal, rougher than recommended, and surrounded by obstacles that would make takeoff extremely challenging. But it was their only option. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The landing was controlled violence. Sarah's aircraft hitting the improvised strip with bone-jarring impact before bouncing twice and finally rolling to a stop mere yards from a cluster of boulders that would have meant certain destruction. The soldiers in the cargo bay had been thrown around despite their safety restraints, but none appeared seriously injured. "Everyone okay back there?" Sarah called. The response was immediate and positive, though several voices carried notes of amazement at what they'd just experienced. Sarah shut down her engines to conserve fuel, knowing that restart and takeoff would be challenging enough without adding fuel concerns to the equation. "Rodriguez, we're on the ground approximately 800 meters from your position. Can you prepare patients for ground transport?" "Roger that, Captain." "Give me 15 minutes to stabilize them properly." Sarah looked at her remaining soldiers, 22. Professionals who had signed up for a routine transport mission and found themselves in the middle of an unauthorized rescue operation in potentially hostile territory. Their faces showed no regret, only determination to see the mission through to successful completion. The real test was still ahead of them. The march to the crash site felt like the longest 800 meters of Sarah's military career. She led a hastily organized rescue team consisting of herself, Corporals Jenkins and Martinez, and 4 other soldiers who had volunteered to carry the improvised stretchers they'd constructed from cargo strapping and equipment pallets. The remaining soldiers stayed with the aircraft, establishing a defensive perimeter and preparing for the possibility of hostile contact. The terrain was even more challenging on foot than it had appeared from the air. Rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation forced the team to take a circuitous route that added precious minutes to their approach time. Every step reminded Sarah that they were operating in contested territory, where enemy forces could be observing their every move. When they finally reached the crash site, Sarah was amazed by what Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had accomplished in 15 minutes. Both pilots had been stabilized with professional efficiency that spoke to years of combat medical training. The unconscious pilot had been secured to a backboard with careful attention to spinal immobilization, while his conscious companion had been treated for blood loss and had his multiple fractures properly splinted. "Status report," Sarah requested, kneeling beside the injured aviators. "Unconscious pilot has severe head trauma, possible skull fracture. Definitely has spinal injuries that could be life-threatening if not handled properly," Rodriguez reported with clinical precision. "Conscious pilot has lost significant blood from lacerations on his left arm and leg, plus what I believe are fractured ribs and a broken collarbone. Both need immediate surgical intervention, but they're stable enough for transport if we're careful." Sarah nodded, studying the faces of the two pilots she was risking everything to save. The unconscious one looked impossibly young, probably fresh out of flight school with dreams of glory that had collided brutally with reality. His conscious companion was older, a veteran whose eyes held the kind of gratitude that made every risk worthwhile. "Thank you," the injured pilot whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought we were going to die here." "Not on my watch," Sarah replied, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. The return journey to the C-130 was a masterclass in military teamwork and improvisation. The soldiers took turns carrying the stretchers over impossible terrain, coordinating their movements to minimize jarring impacts that could worsen the patient's injuries. Rodriguez monitored both pilots continuously, adjusting for drips and checking vital signs, while somehow maintaining perfect footing over rocks and through vegetation that challenged even the unencumbered soldiers. Sarah found herself thinking about the radio chatter she'd been monitoring during their ground operations. Desert Control had been frantically trying to organize official search and rescue assets, while higher command authorities demanded updates on the unauthorized mission being conducted by a routine support flight. She caught fragments of heated discussions about disciplinary action, operational parameters, and the political implications of success versus failure. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting her patients to medical care and her people safely back to base, regardless of what kind of reception awaited them. When they finally reached the aircraft, Sarah was relieved to see that her defensive perimeter had encountered no hostile activity. The soldiers who had remained behind helped load the injured pilots into the cargo bay, where Rodriguez immediately began setting up a mobile medical station using supplies that had originally been destined for routine inventory. "At FOB Delta, how are they looking?" Sarah asked as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging takeoff of her career. "Stable but critical," Rodriguez replied. "The unconscious pilot is showing some positive neurological responses, which is encouraging. The other one is maintaining blood pressure, and his pain levels are manageable. But they both need real medical facilities as soon as possible." Sarah nodded and began her pre-flight checklist, knowing that every minute of delay increased the risk to her patients and potentially to her entire team. The improvised landing strip looked even less suitable for takeoff than it had for landing, with obstacles that seemed to have multiplied during their absence and a surface that would challenge her aircraft's capabilities. "All personnel secure for takeoff," she announced. "This is going to be interesting." The understatement of the year, Sarah thought as she advanced her throttles and felt her C-130 begin its acceleration run. The aircraft bounced and shuddered over the rough ground, building speed slowly while obstacles rushed toward them with terrifying speed. Sarah had calculated the minimum airspeed required for liftoff, but the mathematics of the situation left almost no margin for error. At the last possible moment, She pulled back on her controls and felt the aircraft reluctantly leave the ground, climbing slowly over boulders that passed beneath them with mere feet to spare. Behind her, she heard what might have been prayers or might have been curses from her passengers, but the important thing was that they were airborne and climbing toward safety. Desert Control, Cargo 77 is airborne with 2 medical evacuations. Aboard, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Request priority clearance to FOB Delta and immediate medical support upon arrival. The response came immediately, though the controller's tone suggested that Sarah's unauthorized mission had created considerable controversy at higher levels. Cargo 77, you are cleared direct to FOB Delta. Medical personnel will be standing by. Be advised that you are to report immediately to the base commander upon landing. Sarah smiled grimly. She'd expected no less, but the important thing was that her patients would receive the care they needed. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental responsibility. The flight back to FOB Delta was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatments for 2 critically injured pilots whose lives hung in the balance. The cargo bay had been transformed into an impromptu medical facility, with 4 bags secured to overhead fixtures and medical equipment spread across. Makeshift tables created from cargo containers. "Captain, I'm losing the unconscious pilot," Rodriguez called out, her voice tight with professional concern. "His blood pressure is dropping and his neurological responses are becoming less consistent. We need to get him to a real medical facility. Now." Sarah pushed her throttles forward, coaxing every possible knot of airspeed from her aircraft, while maintaining the smooth flight profile necessary to avoid jarring her patients. The C-130 wasn't built for speed, but she was determined to extract every ounce of performance from the reliable workhorse that had already exceeded every expectation. Through her radio, she could hear the organized chaos of FOB Delta preparing for their arrival. Medical teams were being assembled, surgical facilities prepared, and blood supplies organized for immediate transfusion. But underneath the professional medical coordination, Sarah also detected the unmistakable tension of a command structure, grappling with an unauthorized mission that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. "Desert Control, Cargo 77 requesting direct approach clearance," Sarah transmitted. "I have 1 patient in critical condition requiring immediate surgical intervention." "Cargo 77, you are cleared for straight-in approach runway 27. Medical personnel are standing by, and ... The controller paused, and Sarah could practically hear the internal debate about how much information to share. "Be advised that Colonel Harrison and base command staff will be meeting your aircraft upon arrival." Sarah's stomach tightened. Colonel Harrison was her commanding officer, the same man who had dismissed her capabilities and assigned her to routine supply runs. His presence at her arrival, along with the base command staff, could only mean one thing: her career was about to face its most serious challenge yet. But as she began her approach to FOB Delta, watching the familiar outline of the base growing larger through her windscreen, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed inside her. The pilot who had taken off that morning, accepting limitations and swallowing disappointments, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had proven that capability couldn't be measured by assignment. Sheets are defined by other people's expectations. "How are they doing back there?" she called to Rodriguez. "Conscious pilot is stable and actually improving," the medic reported. "But the other one is touch and go. Every minute counts now." Sarah lined up for her final approach, noting the unusual amount of activity on the ground. Emergency vehicles were positioned near the runway, medical personnel waited with stretchers and equipment, and she could see a cluster of senior officers standing near the base operations building. Word of her unauthorized mission had clearly reached the highest levels of command. The landing was one of her smoothest ever, A perfect touchdown that barely registered in the cargo bay, where Rodriguez continued her life-saving work. As the C-130 rolled to a stop, Sarah could see medical teams rushing toward her aircraft. Their organized efficiency, a testament to military training and professionalism. "Outstanding work, Captain," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Corporal Jenkins, one of the soldiers who had volunteered for the ground rescue operation. "That was the most incredible flying I've ever seen, and I've been in the military for 8 years." Similar comments came from other soldiers as they prepared to disembark. Words of respect and admiration that Sarah had rarely heard in her 3 years of routine support missions. These weren't empty compliments. They were acknowledgments from fellow professionals who had witnessed exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. The cargo door opened and medical personnel swarmed aboard, taking charge of the 2 injured pilots with the kind of coordinated urgency that could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah watched as the unconscious pilot was rushed toward the base hospital, his stretcher surrounded by medical professionals who continued treatment even while moving at a near run. "Captain Mitchell." The voice belonged to Colonel Harrison, who had approached her aircraft with the stone-faced expression that Sarah had come to know well. "You will accompany me to the command center immediately for debriefing." Sarah nodded, knowing that this moment had been inevitable from the instant. She'd made her first course change toward the crash site. She gathered her flight gear and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her, but she felt no regret. 2 fellow aviators were alive because of her actions, and that fact would remain true regardless of what happened to her career. As she walked toward the command center, flanked by Colonel Harrison and followed by other senior officers, Sarah caught sight of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez emerging from the hospital. The medic caught her eye and offered a subtle thumbs-up, a sign that both patients were now in capable hands and their conditions were hopeful. The command center was filled with more brass than Sarah had seen in one place since her graduation. From the Air Force Academy, generals, colonels, and senior staff officers filled a room that usually handled routine operational briefings. Maps covered the walls, radio equipment hummed with activity, and the atmosphere carried the weight of decisions that would affect careers, reputations, and potentially international relations. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for serious disciplinary matters. "You are here to account for actions taken during what was authorized as a routine supply mission to forward operating base Delta. Your deviation from assigned flight path, engagement in unauthorized combat operations, and direct violation of explicit orders represent some of the most serious charges a military aviator can face." Sarah stood at attention, meeting the colonel's gaze directly. She had known this moment would come, had accepted the risks when she made her first decision to help the downed pilots. Now she would face the consequences with the same determination that had carried her through the rescue mission. But something in the room's atmosphere suggested that this debriefing might not follow the script that anyone had expected. The silence in the command center stretched longer than Sarah had anticipated, filled with undercurrents she couldn't quite interpret. Colonel Harrison's expression remained stern, but she noticed subtle glances being exchanged between the senior officers. Silent communications that suggested this debriefing was more complex than a straightforward disciplinary hearing. However, Colonel Harrison continued, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "We have received some rather interesting communications regarding your unauthorized mission." A communications officer stepped forward, carrying a folder thick with printed messages and reports. "Captain Mitchell, in the past 2 hours, we have received direct communications from the Pentagon, Central Command, and congressional offices regarding your actions today. It appears that your rescue mission has attracted attention at the highest levels of government and military leadership." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Attention from the Pentagon and Congress usually meant that a situation had escalated far beyond normal military channels, often with career-ending implications for the officers involved. She braced herself for the full weight of military justice, knowing that her unauthorized actions, however well-intentioned, had clearly created diplomatic and operational complications. Furthermore, another officer added, consulting his own stack of communications, "We have received preliminary reports from the medical team treating the 2 pilots you extracted. Both are expected to make full recoveries, though the unconscious pilot would likely have died without immediate medical intervention." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Both pilots would recover. The unconscious one, barely more than a boy, really would live because she had chosen to act rather than follow protocol. Whatever punishment awaited her, that knowledge would make it bearable. Colonel Harrison opened the communications folder and began reading from what appeared to be an official military message. This morning's unauthorized rescue operation conducted by Captain Sarah Mitchell represents either a serious breach of military discipline or an exceptional example of leadership initiative under crisis conditions. The determination of which characterization applies will depend on a thorough investigation of the circumstances and outcomes involved. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to decode the bureaucratic language. The fact that her actions were being characterized as potentially representing leadership initiative rather than simply insubordination suggested that powerful voices were advocating for her position. But the military was an institution that valued order and hierarchy above almost everything else, and her blatant violation of direct orders would not be easily overlooked. Captain, a general she didn't recognize, spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Walk us through your decision-making process. Help us understand why you chose to disobey direct orders and undertake an unauthorized mission in contested territory." This was her moment, her opportunity to explain actions that had felt so clear and necessary in the moment, but now seemed almost recklessly impulsive under the scrutiny of senior leadership. Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. "Sir, when I heard the Mayday call from Viper 2-1, my initial response was to continue with my assigned mission and trust that appropriate search and rescue assets would handle the emergency. However, as I monitored the communications, it became clear that those assets were either unavailable or too distant to respond in time to save the injured pilots." She paused, gathering her thoughts and trying to find words that would convey the moral imperative she had felt without sounding like she was making excuses for insubordination. "I realized that my aircraft had capabilities that made it uniquely suited for this particular rescue scenario. I had medical personnel on board, cargo handling equipment that could be adapted for emergency extraction, and most importantly, I was in position to reach the crash site before the injured pilots succumbed to their wounds." The general nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "What about the risks, Captain? Operating in contested airspace, landing in unsuitable terrain, conducting operations for which you had no specific authorization or training." "Sir, I assessed those risks against the certainty that 2 fellow aviators would die without immediate intervention. My training prepared me for emergency situations, and my aircraft was capable of the mission requirements. The risk of disciplinary action seemed acceptable when weighed against the loss of life that would result from inaction." Colonel Harrison interjected, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Captain Mitchell, you put 23 other service members at risk with your unauthorized deviation. How do you justify endangering their lives for a mission that wasn't your responsibility?" Sarah had expected this question and had been grappling with it throughout the flight back to base. It was the most serious criticism of her actions, and she knew her answer would be crucial to whatever decision the assembled officers ultimately reached. "Sir, I briefed all personnel on the situation and gave them the opportunity to opt out of the mission. Every single soldier aboard that aircraft volunteered to participate in the rescue operation. They understood the risks and chose to accept Them because they believed, as I did, that saving the lives of fellow service members was worth those risks. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each senior officer in turn. Additionally, sir, I would argue that we had a responsibility to those pilots that superseded our original mission parameters. Military personnel don't abandon fellow service members in distress, regardless of convenience or protocol. The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Sarah sensed that her words had resonated with officers who had spent their careers making similar calculations between duty, risk, and moral obligation. General Morrison, whose nameplate Sarah could now see, leaned back in his chair with an expression that might have been approval. Captain Mitchell, you've presented your case clearly and with obvious conviction. Now we need to discuss the implications of your actions and determine how the military should respond to unauthorized initiative of this magnitude. The future of her career hung in the balance of whatever discussion would follow. The deliberation that followed felt endless to Sarah, though in reality it lasted only 20 minutes. She was asked to wait in an adjacent office while the senior officers discussed her case, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her military career might be over before she'd had the chance to prove what she was truly capable of achieving. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of heated discussion voices raised in debate about precedent, military discipline, operational success, and the broader implications of her actions. Some voices seemed supportive, emphasizing the successful outcome and the lives saved. Others clearly viewed her insubordination as a dangerous precedent that could undermine military order and discipline. During the wait, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, still wearing her medical gear from treating the rescued pilots. Captain, I wanted to update you on the patients before you heard it through official channels. Sarah looked up hopefully. How are they doing? Both are stable now and expected to make full recoveries, Rodriguez reported with a smile. The unconscious pilot regained consciousness about 30 minutes ago. First thing he asked about was whether his wingman was okay, and second thing he asked about was who flew the rescue mission. When I told him it was the captain of a C-130 transport, he said he wanted to thank you personally. The news hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. Throughout the stress of the debriefing and uncertainty about her future, she hadn't allowed herself to fully process the human dimension of what had happened. 2 young aviators were alive, would recover completely, and would return to their families because she had chosen to act rather than follow protocol. There's something else, Rodriguez continued. Word of what happened today has spread throughout the base. I've never seen morale this high or heard more positive talk about leadership and taking care of fellow service members. What you did today reminded everyone why they joined the military in the first place. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the command center opened and Colonel Harrison appeared. Captain Mitchell, please return for the conclusion of your debriefing. Sarah walked back into the room with her head held high, regardless of what decision awaited her. The assembled officers had arranged themselves more formally, with General Morrison clearly positioned as the senior decision-maker. The atmosphere felt less charged than before, though Sarah couldn't determine whether that was positive or negative for her situation. Captain Mitchell, General Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of official pronouncement. After thorough discussion of your actions today, this command has reached several conclusions that will affect both your immediate situation and your future military career. Sarah braced herself, knowing that the next few minutes would define everything that followed. First, regarding the unauthorized nature of your mission, while your deviation from assigned flight path and engagement in combat operations without explicit approval constitute clear violations of military protocol, the circumstances surrounding those violations were exceptional and the outcomes achieved were overwhelmingly positive. The general paused, consulting notes that had been prepared during the deliberation. Second, Regarding your decision-making process and leadership during the crisis, your assessment of the tactical situation was accurate, your evaluation of available resources was thorough, and your execution of an extremely complex rescue operation under challenging conditions was exemplary. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, though she knew that military praise often preceded punishment as a way of softening the blow of disciplinary action. Third, regarding the broader implications of your actions, this command recognizes that rigid adherence to protocol, while generally essential for military effectiveness, can sometimes prevent the kind of initiative and leadership that represents the best traditions of military service. General Morrison stood, his expression now clearly indicating approval rather than censure. "Captain Mitchell, effective immediately, you are being reassigned from transport operations to search and rescue command. Your demonstrated capabilities in crisis management, unconventional operations, and leadership under pressure make you ideally suited for missions that require exactly the kind of initiative you displayed today." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as she processed what she was hearing. Instead of punishment, she was being promoted to exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful assignments she had dreamed of receiving throughout her career. Furthermore, Colonel Harrison added, his previous stern demeanor replaced by something approaching respect, "Your actions today have prompted a comprehensive review of how we utilize pilot capabilities and assign mission responsibilities. It appears that we may have been underestimating the potential of several of our aviators." The general handed Sarah a new set of orders, crisp papers that represented a complete transformation of her military career. "Your first assignment will be to develop training protocols for unconventional rescue operations using transport aircraft. Your experience today suggests that we may have been thinking too narrowly about the capabilities of our existing assets." Sarah accepted the orders with hands that trembled slightly, still struggling to believe that her career-ending insubordination had somehow transformed into career-defining recognition. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." "Captain, General," Morrison replied with a slight smile, "I don't think anyone in this room has any doubts about your capabilities anymore. The question is whether we can create enough challenging assignments to keep you properly occupied." As the briefing concluded and the senior officers began to disperse, Sarah realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the overlooked transport pilot assigned to routine supply runs. She was now a search and rescue specialist with the authority and responsibility to save lives in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The young woman, who had been dismissed as just support, had finally found her place in the military hierarchy, and it was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the same briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base where her transformation had begun. But everything about her presence there had fundamentally changed. Instead of receiving routine transport assignments, she was now conducting advanced training seminars for pilots from across the military, teaching the unconventional rescue techniques that had emerged from her unauthorized mission to save Viper. 2-1. The pilots filling the briefing room represented the elite of military aviation search and rescue specialists, combat pilots, and transport aviators who had been selected for advanced crisis response training. They listened with the kind of focused attention that Sarah had rarely experienced during her years of routine assignments, hanging on every word as she described the decision-making process and execution challenges of her career-defining rescue mission. "The key principle," Sarah explained, pointing to a tactical diagram on the projection screen, "is recognizing that aircraft capabilities extend far beyond their primary mission parameters. A transport plane isn't just a cargo hauler, it's a versatile platform that can be adapted for medical evacuation, personnel extraction, and emergency resupply operations in environments where specialized aircraft can't operate." In the front row, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, recently promoted and now serving as Sarah's deputy in the new Unconventional Rescue Operations Division, nodded approvingly. The former staff sergeant had chosen to transition from medical service to aviation operations, her experience during the rescue mission having revealed capabilities that the military was eager to develop further. Captain Mitchell, one of the attending pilots, raised his hand. How do you balance the risks of unauthorized operations against the potential for saving lives? The line between initiative and insubordination seems pretty thin. Sarah smiled, remembering when she had struggled with exactly the same question. The key is thorough assessment of the situation and honest evaluation of your capabilities. You can't let protocol prevent you from saving lives, but you also can't let good intentions justify reckless actions. Every decision has to be based on realistic assessment of risks versus potential outcomes. She clicked to the next slide, which showed photographs of the two pilots she had rescued. Both had returned to active duty, fully recovered from their injuries and now serving as vocal advocates for the kind of flexible thinking that had saved their lives. Lieutenant Williams and Captain Torres, the pilots from Viper 2-1, have become integral parts of our training program, Sarah continued. They provide perspective from the receiving end of rescue operations, helping us understand what works and what doesn't from the patient's point of view. After the training session concluded, Sarah found herself walking across the base toward the flight line, where her new aircraft waited for the afternoon's training mission. It wasn't a routine transport C-130 anymore. Her current aircraft was a specially modified version, equipped with advanced medical facilities, expanded communications equipment, and enhanced defensive systems that allowed it to operate in contested environments. The transformation in her career had been remarkable, but equally important was the change in how the military viewed pilot capabilities and mission assignments. The review prompted by her unauthorized mission had revealed dozens of aviators whose skills were being underutilized, leading to reassignments and new programs that better matched pilot capabilities with mission requirements. Captain Mitchell. A voice called from behind her. She turned to see General Morrison, the same officer who had presided over her potentially career-ending debriefing 6 months earlier. He was now a strong supporter of the Unconventional Operations Program and had been instrumental in securing funding and authority for expanded training. General, good to see you. How can I help you? I wanted to personally deliver some news that I think you'll find interesting, the general replied, holding an official-looking document. The two pilots you rescued have been selected for advanced flight training programs that will significantly accelerate their career progression. Additionally, congressional testimony about their rescue has led to increased funding for search and rescue operations across all service branches. Sarah accepted the document, scanning its contents with growing amazement. The ripple effects of her single unauthorized mission had spread far beyond anything she could have imagined, influencing policy decisions, budget allocations, and training programs throughout the military. There's one more thing, General Morrison added with a slight smile. The President has personally approved a commendation for your actions during the Viper 2-1 rescue. The ceremony is scheduled for next month at the White House. Sarah felt the same disorientation she had experienced during her debriefing, struggling to process recognition that exceeded her wildest dreams. From a dismissed support pilot to presidential commendation in 6 months, it seemed impossible, but it was documented in the official orders she held in her hands. As the general departed and Sarah continued toward her aircraft, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had been told she was perfect for support operations had discovered that support could be the most important mission of all, when it meant the difference between life and death for fellow service members. Her radio crackled with the familiar voice of air traffic control. Rescue 77, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 27. Have a safe mission, Captain. Roger that, Control, Sarah replied, advancing her throttles and feeling her aircraft respond with the eager power of a machine designed for challenging missions. Rescue 77 is rolling. as her wheels left the runway and she climbed toward another training mission that would prepare more pilots for the kind of crisis response that saved lives. Sarah Mitchell knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the military and in the world. She was no longer just support, she was exactly what she had always been meant to be. She was a rescue pilot, and that made all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.